I would like to take just a quick second to welcome you to the National Press Club and say this is a great place. It is the eminent club for journalists here in Washington, D.C. and the world. We have a lot of great events like this one. Just to give you a couple of examples, on the 17th of this month, we have a press versus politicians spelling bee. Feel free to come. This is open to the public. You get to see, well, it's pretty obvious. Journalists go against members of Congress in a spell off, as it were. And then very excited to also have an event on the 25th, which is journalists. We'll have 4 journalists from Nicaragua, most of them in exile, talk about media suppression there. I'm sure you've all followed the news in the last year about a lot of things that have been going on in Nicaragua, including attacks on journalists. But anyway, to get it to this event, I'm going to introduce our moderator. Jamal Abdul Alim is an education editor, for The Conversation, an award-winning journalist from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He broke into the news business as a crime reporter in the old Milwaukee Sentinel during his undergraduate years. He has covered higher education for more than a decade, mostly as a freelancer for a wide range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Education Week, Washington Monthly, The Hechinger Report, and diverse issues in higher education. And with that, I'm going to give it over to Jamal, and he is now in charge. Thank you. Jamal, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to the members of the audience for joining us this morning. Even if you're only here as an excuse to get out of the office, we're honored that you chose us to be that excuse. With that, let me introduce our panelists. To my far left is Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief at Washington Monthly, as well as the College Guide and rankings that they put out every year, and also a great mentor to none other than yours truly. To my in the middle is Kaitlin Mulhere, associate editor at Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine, and to my left is Kaitlin Mulhere, reporter and special projects editor for Money. Well, that's quite dual role there, reporter and editor, I tell you. And so before we begin, just wanted to note that the Press Club invited U.S. News as well as the Wall Street Journal both to participate and to discuss their rankings, but they declined. So with that, we'd like to get into the discussion of higher ed at a crossroads and what role does the media play in the crisis. I guess the editor in me wants to say what role, if any, does the media play in the crisis. But Kaitlin Mulhere, if you could just please begin with a kind of an overview of the higher admission scandal that broke earlier this year.
Yeah, so unless you guys were under a rock, you probably remember back in March when the FBI arrested about 50 people for a variety of charges: racketeering, money laundering, mail fraud, money fraud, all related to helping the children of wealthy families get into a handful of schools. So I think the investigators said the parents, about 30 parents were also arrested. They paid a combined $25 million to a variety of people to get their children into these schools. And there were 2 main ways they did this. One was by like bribing or paying off testing center proctors to help their students get higher SAT and ACT scores. And then the other was bribing college athletic officials to get their applicants a like special athlete flag for sports that they didn't in fact play, let alone be good enough to play at the collegiate level. So since March, I think everyone, or most all of the people who were charged have filed, either pleaded guilty or non-guilty. Of the parents, I think it's about split down the middle between those who have pleaded guilty versus not guilty. The college athletic officials, interestingly, like almost all of them have pleaded not guilty. And so far, only one person has been sentenced, I think. But next week, one of the most high-profile people, actress Felicity Huffman, is set to be scheduled, and she's accused. She pleaded guilty, and she paid $15,000 to let her daughter have, I think, unlimited time to take her SATs. So I think one thing that's interesting is since this happened in March, I think we're still going to see that the hearings are ongoing in Boston, and Even this week, there were some documents that came out related to how important donations are, how much admissions officials at the University of Southern California pay attention to donations when deciding whether to admit students. So I think that there's probably more information, and depending on who you are, more embarrassment to come out as these cases continue.
Yeah, and I wish we could get deeper into that because I mean there's always kind of a rationale behind some of these things. But with that, we'd like to allow each panelist to provide kind of an overview of their college rankings, as well as the editorial focus. And then at the same time, this is going to be a marvelous feat, answer the question, what role, if any, does the media play in the admissions crisis? And I mean, we're all editors and reporters, so I know we're quite skilled at getting to the point, trimming things down. So maybe, Paul, you might want to go first?
Sure, be happy to. Michael Kinsley, the great editor and journalist, famously said that in Washington, the real scandal is not what's illegal, the real scandal is what's legal. And by that he meant it's not the bag of cash given to the congressman to change his vote or her vote. It's the perfectly legal PAC contribution that's not a front page news story, but a FEC filing. Nobody notices. And I think that's the case with this scandal, this Varsity Blues scandal. It's a great story. It's a Shakespearean story. It's great. Everybody enjoys it. But if we treat it as, well, shame on those rich financiers and B-list celebrities for cheating the system, and those squash coaches for taking the money, and the reform ought to be, more audits of squash coaches, a little tightening of the processes, then we're missing the underlying scandal, the legal scandal, which is we have a system of higher education in this country that so tilts benefits, so tilts acclaim, so tilts focus and attention on a handful of elite schools that it warps how the whole country, and certainly the professional class, looks at the role of college in America. And instead of universities being a source of equality and democracy, they become engines of inequality and oligarchy. And I believe it's that bad. I think we have gone through a multi-decade period in our country where what used to be the gateway for average people, low-income people to gain entry into the middle class has become a way for the upper middle class and the truly wealthy to perpetuate their privilege. And that's done legally, and it is abetted by the press, I believe. And so when we started the college rankings at the Washington Monthly, we looked at the dominant ranking at the time, and still the dominant ranking, U.S. News and World Report, and looked at what their metrics are. And their metrics are boiled down, there's many of them, but they boil down to three simple things. They rank schools based on exclusivity, meaning how few students they let in. Wealth, meaning how much money they take in and spend on students. And fame, based on reputation. What do other colleges, presidents, and so forth think of that college? And when you have a system like that, what it really winds up being is a kind of acknowledgement and perpetuation of the idea that certain elite schools define what a good college is, right? A good college is a college that's sort of like a country club with beautiful grounds and so forth and wealthy people, but with lectures instead of golf. That's our idea of a good college. And what happens is all the other college presidents, in order to become important and gain in stature, try to turn their colleges into that. And what happens is that fewer and fewer colleges are available to educate the 90+% of students who can't get into selective schools but need a college degree to enter or stay in the middle class. And it leads to these insane illegal scandals, right? And it makes states wind up giving more money to flagship universities that educate the upper middle class whites, and half as much money per student to, say, community colleges that educate folks of color and lower income. So
your rankings actually kind of shift the focus.
That's right. That's right. It was a long-winded way of getting to the point, which is what we do. What we do is we measure three things. First of all, we ask not what is the best ranking for upper middle class parents and kids to find a good school. We say what are the best colleges for taxpayers who are shelling out $180 billion in revenue every year supporting the higher education system. What do the taxpayers and citizens want out of their system? Number one, we say they want upward mobility. And so we measure things like percentage of Pell Grants and graduation rates and what students are making 10 years after they start the university. And are they charging a reasonable price for the degree itself for essentially median income and below families. Number two, taxpayers want their colleges to produce the research, the scholars and scholarship that drive the economy and human flourishing. And number three, we want colleges to encourage students to become better citizens, to give back to their country and their community. So we measure things like the number of percentage of ROTC at the university, those who go on to the Peace Corps, and whether the school does a good job of voting and or encouraging their students to vote. So those three things, upward mobility, research, and service, we call it. If every college were to compete for rising on our rankings, and I hope they do, we would have a country that's not more inegalitarian, but more egalitarian, more prosperous, and more democratic. So that's the basic idea. And we get all kinds of very odd schools that U.S. News and others don't make the top of their rankings, do make the top of ours.
Excellent, excellent. So, Kaitlin, being editor of a personal finance magazine, perhaps you could speak about what are some of the distinguishing characteristics of the rankings that you produce?
Absolutely. So if you're familiar with the Kiplinger brand, you'll know that a key word for us is value. We always are looking at value, whether it's about investments or retirement savings, or in this case, colleges. And for colleges, we define value as a high-quality education at an affordable price. This has been our bread and butter for 20 plus years now. We've been doing these rankings since the late 90s. And a lot of our focus has remained pretty constant. We're looking to help families zero in on schools that are going to give them the best bang for their educational buck and really help them find schools that are a good fit for their kid. We're not interested in just promoting the same group of schools every year. Certainly there are schools that appear year after year in our rankings because they're great schools and they do a great job of getting students to graduation day for less money, with less debt, and so on. To that end, quality metrics account for 55% of our methodology, and affordability criteria account for 45%. If you're looking for a more detailed overview, there's a page in the magazine that was left outside that has a breakdown of our methodology. So that part has remained consistent, but we do review the rankings and our methodology yearly. We actually just finished a big review this year of the methodology and made a lot of changes to account for just shifts in the higher education sphere in general. To encourage families to start their college search with a broader array of options, we expanded our rankings to include 400 ranked schools as well as 100 schools that still represent a great value but didn't quite make our initial cutoff. We continue to award points most heavily for four-year graduation rate, but we are also awarding points for 5- and 6-year graduation rates to represent the benefit that comes from earning a degree, even if it does take an extra year. And we've added metrics to award schools that help students with financial need make it to graduation day, and also revised our rankings to place less emphasis on several factors, including test scores and admission rates. They're still in there, but they definitely account for far less than they used to.
When all is said and done, to what extent do your rankings mirror the results of, say, U.S. News and World Report? Are they similar, or? they come out quite different?
You're certainly going to find schools that appear on both lists, kind of your usual suspects, if you will. But there are a lot of schools in there that I get letters from readers all the time. I never heard of this school. It's a great school, but we want to highlight those schools. Each year we write a profile piece on one or two schools, and historically that has been a school that isn't probably the first 10 you're going to name if you're naming a group of higher ed institutions. And we get great feedback from readers talking about how they didn't consider that school for their child, and maybe it's a good fit for them or maybe that's not, but it did get them thinking outside the box. This summer I was traveling for work, and I seem to find people who have college-age kids who like to talk to me not knowing what I do. It just seems to happen a lot. And then I'm on the airplane and this woman starts talking to me about how her daughter is attending a school that is number, I think it was 16 on a particular ranking. And she's really disappointed because this girl got into number 1 and the girl didn't like number 1 and she's not going to go. And this mother is telling me how her daughter is not going to succeed or not going to be as successful as if she attended number 1. And at that point I told her what I do and some of the data, and we started talking. I don't know what she walked away thinking, but that is certainly the perception she had, is that number 1 is how many times better than number 16, and that was setting her daughter up for success or failure. And that's unfortunately the perception a lot of people have of rankings.
That's interesting, because before I move to Kaitlin for money, the question of whether or not the media has a role in the actions of what people do, how they make choices about which institution they want their child to go to. So do you see the media as being kind of complicit in the circumstances that led to the admission scandal, or?
I think we play a part in it. The number of conversations I've had with both readers of Kiplinger who contact me directly through phone and email at work or just kind of out in the world, people are reading these rankings and they are taking them to heart. But while the three of us could go on all day about our metrics and the weightings and the details behind them, a lot of what they take away from them is the actual rank. This school is number 27. Or maybe one factoid of this school doesn't give loans, or this school has a really strong grad rate. And those things are important, but it shouldn't be the only reason this school is on someone's application list or why they're visiting the school. And I think it's partially our duty to help them understand our rankings in a more nuanced way, and not just say, here's the top 10 schools, go visit them and apply.
Excellent, excellent. So, Kaitlin, from money, if you could speak to what distinguishes your rankings from others, and then also, do you see the media as being complicit in the circumstances that led to the admission scandal?
Yes, so I'd say Money's rankings are almost kind of a combination of some of the things that both Paul and Kaitlin highlighted. So we are also a personal finance brand, so we define a good college in much the same way as Kiplinger, which is a high quality education at an affordable price. That said, we have a lot of measures that are also tied to socioeconomic mobility. We look at how many Pell Grant recipients a college graduates. We use the Opportunities Insight figures from Raj Chetty that look at the percentage of bottom income quintile students who are admitted and go on to join the upper income quintile. It's a tongue twister. In terms of how we differ, we look a lot at affordability. We have a unique net price of degree calculation that looks obviously at the sticker price, but then the average institutional aid awarded, as well as the average amount of time it takes students to graduate, since that affects how much a degree costs. We also look at average borrowing both among students but also parents. And we also look at earnings quite a bit. But in recent years, we've put more emphasis on other outcome measures, including some college scorecard statistics about the share of graduates who are not employed and not working, which is sort of a proxy for unemployment, though not exactly the same thing. And then also the share of graduates who are earning more than a high school graduate. And then another area that we're really proud of and we highlight a lot in our rankings is our value-added metrics. So in each of our 3 buckets, which is quality of education, affordability, and outcomes, we have a couple measures that are value-added. And so basically what that means is, for the graduation rate, for example, we know that colleges that admit students who have higher SAT scores, higher high school GPAs, students from wealthier backgrounds, students who attend full-time, those colleges, those types of students are more likely to graduate college regardless of where they go. And so colleges that have a lot of those students, you would expect to have very high graduation rates. So with the value-added metrics, we basically compare colleges based on their student bodies and look at which colleges are doing better or worse to similar schools. And so that helps, some schools with, a 60 or 70% graduation rate spike to the top of our rankings, right alongside, the Ivy League colleges with their 90% graduation rate. And in terms of, you asked Kaitlin about how are the schools on our list compare to U.S. News and World Report. One thing, you'll certainly see the same usual suspects towards the top, but I know when I looked at our top 50 this year, it was, I think, about 30, 35 public schools, which is very different than U.S. News and World Report's top, which are largely wealthy private schools. So yeah, and I will say, I put out a handout. Sadly, Money does not have a printed magazine anymore, so we don't have a pretty glossy handout for you guys, but I do have a handout that goes through each of the 26 metrics that we go through, and we have a much lengthier methodology online should you have more interest. In terms of the question about what role does the media play, I'm hesitant to, I guess, say anything about the media at large because I think it's a diverse ecosystem of publications. And I think some publications do a lot of work at trying to dispel the admissions hysteria that I think had a role in the admissions scandal. But that said, yes, I think undeniably the media plays a role in this, right? The decisions we make about what colleges to cover and to what extent, reinforce the idea that there are certain elite colleges that are more important than the public colleges and, to Paul's point, the community colleges that that enroll and also graduate far more students than this, Ivy League plus Stanford and MIT group that we're always seemingly writing about.
I guess I'd like to ask the question slightly different. Does it seem like the admissions scandal would have taken place irrespective of rankings and what's written about in the media? Do these schools have reputations that kind of transcend anything that we do?
I think it's like a chicken and egg scenario. I don't know what came first. With Money's rankings, I think we try and really make the point that that there's no one best college for everyone, and that there are both. It matters where you go to school, because similar schools have very different outcomes for the students, but also that there are hundreds of good schools, and so it's hard to say. I mean, I do think that there are certain schools that would, even if we eliminated all rankings tomorrow, people would continue to try and cheat their way into, yes.
Now, as education editor at The Conversation, we handle stories written by university scholars. And so one of the things I'm curious about is what role does education research play in the shaping of your rankings? I know you mentioned Raj Chetty. And some of the research that he's doing on upward mobility. But maybe, Paul, perhaps you could speak to, I know you actually have an academic who's involved in overseeing the rankings.
I was telling Kaitlin, some years ago, tried to take the rankings in-house and did it ourselves, and we so screwed it up that we had to put out an apology for getting some of the numbers wrong. So since then, we've had professional academics handle it. Kevin Carey of the New America Foundation, who's not a PhD but is a great researcher, and now Robert Kelchin of Seton Hall University, who's one of the preeminent young higher education scholars in the country, and I sleep soundly at night. Mm-hmm. And both of them are very much, and we all at the magazine, we read a lot over the course of the year. They do nothing but read and contribute to the higher ed scholarship. So, and our focus is very much also on the policies that lead to the current state of higher education and questioning some of those policies. So, the political science and politics of higher education is really also central to our mandate.
What's your sense as to the extent to which these rankings are measuring what the institutions, what the colleges and universities are actually doing versus kind of ranking the students that they admit? Because there's some research that speaks to how, the rankings kind of mirror the caliber of students that are admitted. Perhaps one of you could speak to that? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what our value-added metrics are targeted toward, which is, to some degree, leveling the playing field among what's coming in and what's coming out, basically. And it is pretty I guess, surprising to look at colleges that have really similar. I get phone calls from a lot of colleges that want to know why they rank lower than their peer institutions. They say they admit really similar students, and it often comes down to those metrics, that their graduation rate is a lot lower than students who have similar scores and come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. So do I think we completely eradicate the differences? No, definitely not. I think that's too hard. It's too hard to probably do, but we do our best to try.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll open up for questions right after this one. But one of the terms that comes up a lot in the rankings is quality. And Kaitlin, I heard you speak to that. If you could just maybe kind of elaborate on how quality factors in, and how do you even get at what quality is? I know you mentioned that it has something to do with instruction, but how does, reporter or editor, somewhere figure out that, hey, this institution is offering, what happens in the classroom there is actually making a difference?
Right. Now, finding the right metrics to piece together for the quality component is, I think, a challenge for anyone who's running rankings. We sit around every year and debate this. And to your earlier point, we started pulling points away from certain metrics like admission rate, just because schools that are admitting the smallest slice and they're getting the quote-unquote best students they're going to succeed. So pulling points away from certain things is, I think, sometimes just as important as awarding points for certain things, and not necessarily sticking to what was done, in our case, 20 years ago. But on the quality side of our rankings, we are looking at the quality of students coming in. After speaking with a lot of our readers, we know that it's important to them to have their student go to a school that is competitive, not necessarily admitting 4%, 5%, but doesn't admit every student. That is important to our readers who are looking for that component for their child's education. But really, we look at a slice of that, and then we move on from that, because it doesn't tell you a lot about a student's experience at the school. We're looking at the size of classes, the instructional environment, things like that. We are specifically focused on data in the common data set, which is somewhat limiting, but we are just getting information from there, vetting it all with the schools. So we look at quality in those ways for metrics, but we also talk a lot about the quality of our data. Working with data that is high quality and doesn't have problems is half the battle sometimes. A lot of the data sets that we receive from data providers have problems. The data sets we receive from schools have problems that need to be vetted and resolved. And just one issue can create a whole domino effect throughout the rankings. So it's not just the quality components for the education, but the quality of the data. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy making sure we're using high quality data in all of our metrics.
Yeah. I know it can be unnerving when you discover an error. And it just makes you wonder, well, what else is wrong? So, yeah. So, listen, we'd like to open up to questions from the audience. I guess the one thing I would ask is that when you ask a question, to please identify yourself, state your name and your affiliation. So I see a question over here.
And just wait a second, I'll bring. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Richard Jordan, the Dean of NGO Representatives at the UN over 40 years. Kaitlin, a question for you. My Chinese students all are interested in one thing, leadership. In your evaluated metrics, do you find leadership anywhere? Thank you.
No, that's a good question. No, we don't like measure whether graduates go on to leadership roles. Is that?
Did this college teach me how to be a leader?
Okay, right. No, it kind of reflects the question that Jamal asked. Is there's really no national measure of like what exactly colleges are teaching or how much students are learning. So we don't measure that. No.
Yeah, actually, I wish I could say more. Actually, I have a story planned on that soon. All I can say is just check for the conversation in the future. No, seriously, it gets to that exact issue. All right. Any additional? Go ahead. Okay.
Jason Dunham with Selbus. In all three of you, in your methodology, do you account for firewalling off degree programs, Do you account for counseling good and bad, Georgia State being good, Indiana University being bad? And do you account for overmatch and undermatch? In other words, in your ranking, does it harm a university if someone goes to Duke University to be a pre-med and ends up with a degree in sociology?
What was the first?
Firewalling. Like Duke, University of Michigan, they have they'll admit you. That doesn't mean the College of Engineering admitted you. That just means the university admitted you. Same thing with Johns Hopkins, same thing with Cal Poly, same thing with UT Austin.
So I guess on that first question, that raises an interesting point. I don't know if there's any rankings of like schools at universities. That could be quite interesting, especially when you consider the fact that, you know, there's all these discussions at the federal policy level about trying to assess the quality of a degree, not just from a school, not just from a particular college, but from a particular program. In other words, if you major in this, how much do you make? What is your student debt going to be? Things of that nature. So I don't know if there's any rankings they get at that at
Well,
all.
I think there's no data, right? And I
Yeah.
think you know there will be rankings if and when the federal government produces this program level data.
Yeah. There is college measures, though, I've heard of, you know,
Yeah.
at the state. I think there's
Maybe some states,
Yeah.
right? You know, for us, we need national data that's comparable across state lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like Virginia, Texas, Florida, Colorado, maybe a handful of other states have program level earnings and debt figures, but a minority. It's very rare.
But there were other, I think I heard two other questions from the gentleman, if you want to take a stab at any of those, or?
Counseling,
Yeah.
good or bad at universities, and overmatching and undermatching.
I can answer that we've written a lot of stories about the counseling issue, quite a few, and it's important to us. We don't have any ranking data in our rankings per se, and I don't know that there is good data for that, but it is a huge issue for us. On the overmatching and undermatching, again, not in our data set, but you're absolutely right. It's a very interesting and important issue, especially for low-income students. It's really where selectivity is valuable, other than helping put you in a school with a good social network or your kind of people, is for the less prepared, lower income students who, when they go to a university that matches their SATs and their aptitude, have more likely to graduate and do well. For the rest of us, for us, you know, the kids of the upper middle class, you know, you can put them in a Starbucks for 4 years with their friends and phones, and they're going to be fine. They'll learn wherever they go. They can go to any college, and there's really no difference in their earnings 10 years out.
I will just add, we try to look at counseling, career counseling. We used to look at like the number of career counselors a college had, as well as whether they had like formal programs for networking and internships, and found that almost every college says that they have those resources, and there's no real judgment of like how good they are. So we took it out of our methodology a few years ago.
That's definitely an area I would love to look at, is the effectiveness of career services.
Yeah.
You know, whether or not that makes a difference.
Yeah, it's interesting because students always say they're worthless. So.
Yeah. All
I
right.
want to point out we actually recreated the college experience right here. The front row is empty.
Hi, Megan Boyanton, reporter with Cronkite News at Arizona PBS. So I actually have two questions, and any and all speakers can address this, about your metrics. One, does anyone factor in out-of-state tuition when it comes to affordability? Because, as you know, that can be a difference of tens of thousands of dollars when it comes to students. And two, and maybe this is touching on what you guys just discussed, but does anyone account for the number of students who leave with staggering debt, or does that play into the factor that there is no data for that?
You can start.
So I'll start. So we have 4 lists, if you will. Years ago, we had 3: private universities, liberal arts colleges, and public universities. The public list has 2 lists within it. One is for in-state students, addressing the first question, and the other part of that is, of course, the list for out-of-state students. Back in 2015, we said, but a lot of families don't necessarily care if their child goes to a public or a private school. They just want the best school for them. And we've created this fourth list where we are ranking schools, regardless of which category they're in, all against each other. Everybody's in the same big pot of soup and seeing where they land on this list. That list is based on out-of-state cost figures. And all 4 of those lists, or 4.5 if you want to count that public list partially twice, I guess, all of those lists include data on the percentage of students who borrow, as well as the average debt at graduation.
Yeah, we do not look at out-of-state tuition. It's a frequent complaint we get from readers. One actually comical one we got, if you look at our list, there's a ton of California schools. And so somebody asked whether our list was sponsored by the state of California. It is, I think like I said, most students go to public schools, and most of those students attend public schools in their own state. And that varies, of course. Some states like North Carolina, I think more than 90% of students are in-state. It's very hard to get in as an out-of-state student. And so I don't know how much factoring out-of-state tuition into the prices for that would be reflective of the average attendee. And then student debt, yes, we look at average student borrowing at graduation, and we also look at the share of students paying down their debt as well as default rates.
Yeah, I would check the point that Kaitlin just made. Us upper middle class folks send our kids to schools outside of our metro areas. 90% of the public does not. So for most people, out-of-state tuition isn't an issue. I believe that we factor it in because we take our cost numbers from the federal government's college scorecard, and I think they put both out-of-state and in-state in there. I'm not 100% sure. But we're only looking at costs for families at the median income and below. We figure for the more affluent folks, they can figure it out. So that's the answer.
I'm Jamie Horwitz. I'm an active member of the Press Club. I also have 3 kids in college in 2019. And years ago, I used to handle higher education issues at the American Federation of Teachers. And the thing that I find, you were talking about counseling, but I think beyond that, it's office hours with faculty. And there's been a real explosion of adjunct faculty around the United States. And almost none of these adjunct professors, even if they're good, they're not getting paid office hours. And
they don't have offices.
They don't have offices. And I mean, we used to call them freeway flyers or road scholars because they lived in their cars going from college to college. But I mean, I think that's a real factor. And I hear a lot of my son's peers talking about how they don't know their professors and they don't know how to get career advice or academic advice. I think it's more than counseling services. And is there any? And by the way, what I heard from faculty back then, I haven't worked at AFT for a decade and a half, but a lot of the faculty would talk about how, and not, I'm sure none of your studies, but more U.S. News, how a lot of their schools were gaming the metrics, which is something that I wish the media would take a look more closely at.
There is a group that has gathered numbers for most colleges, or a big group of colleges, on the percentage of their faculty that is adjunct. And we looked at it and thought about using it, and I guess we'll probably do something on it, but it's not clear to us that there's a direct connection between adjunct faculty and quality of teaching. A lot of adjunct faculty members are terrific. I think the issue is how colleges treat their adjunct faculty.
Yeah, but the counseling issue, like I said, I'm not talking about the teaching. I'm saying having availability to talk to your faculty member after class or before class or at an office hour is like non-existent.
I don't know. I can speak as a former adjunct. I mean, I got students who are, working and I mean, not to toot my own horn, but they thank me for some of the things that I mentioned. And other things, I mean, we got email, phones, and I just wonder, lack of an office, how critical is that? I mean, there's things that can be done, especially for a student that has the hustle and the drive to do things. So I don't know. I just wouldn't want to paint adjuncts with a broad brush. And then we have a question in the back. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. I also graduated from the illustrious Howard University, also here in Washington. And at Howard, one of the things that have always been noted about our school over the course of a lot of decades is that we're able to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less resources, considering like all the really, really rich institutions around us like Georgetown, George Washington, George Mason, American, like schools like that. So like, do you see like a metric being planned in the future to be able to account for colleges who have the money that are able to invite an ambassador to their school and make them sign a contract and say, all right, well, if you come to our school, you can't go over to Howard? Or a situation like that, where you're gaming the system in a blockade type of corner the market type of way from an educational perspective, to where it literally turns into a legal battle or a fight just to be able to educate your children. Have y'all heard of situations like that? And how do you think Howard University should handle situations like that in terms of moving forward in the United States? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question that I don't know if I have an answer to. I'm not aware of anything that tracks that, nationally, which is what I think we would need to include it in a ranking. It sounds like something that'd make for a better story.
I know that there are some rankings that actually consider HBCUs. I don't know if any of yours get into that at all, or
Ours do in a small way. So basically, the first cut we do, we do a couple things, but one of them is a college has to have an above median graduation rate for its sector, and HBCUs are a separate sector. So it's private, four-year, public, and HBCU colleges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess one of the interesting things would be to look at is the earnings, right, of historically black college graduates in relation to others. I don't know if anyone has examined that or could speak to that at all. Or,
We don't break out HBCUs individually, but they're there in our rankings, and we've looked at them, and surprise, surprise, there's a range, right? Some of them are just phenomenal, and some of them are not so good, and some of the not so good ones are getting better, like Paul Quinn in Dallas. But one thing I can say, at least a little bit responsive to the gentleman's question, is one of our issues with U.S. News is that you get points for the more you spend, right? Which is an incentive for colleges to spend more money. And we know from looking at the data that you don't have to spend a lot of money to get fine outcomes. There's probably some floor beyond which you hurt quality, but you can do a tremendous amount of excellent teaching with great outcomes for a modest amount of money. And so, it's the mind of the consumer who thinks, well, I don't know what quality is, but if the price is high enough, it must be good, right? And that's how consumers think, and the higher education system plays on that sort of weird limit in the human mind.
Then there's another point that was made, was that historically black colleges do more with less. I'm wondering, just not just HBCUs, but do any of your rankings look at the resources that the schools have? In other words, what are they working with, and then what are they achieving? Because, hey, if an HBCU is getting, the results themselves might be less than another school, but when you look at the resources that they have, then maybe if those are factored in, then maybe it makes more sense. And then if they get superior results and they're not spending as much, then that's even more noteworthy. So do you look at what schools are actually given from the state? Does that come into play at all? Or?
We don't, but it's a good point, and it's something that we're beginning to explore, because there are now data sets that exist that have pretty good measures of spending in different categories: spending on education, spending on facilities, spending on research, and I think that a lot of good journalism will come from exploring those data sets.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Eileen Schleff. I'm a member of the press club, and I'm currently a consultant. What I'm going to bring up is about 30 years ago, and I don't want to skew the discussion, but I left the Department of Ed to study for a doctorate in higher ed administration at USC. And at the same time, I was director of development at East LA College. My dissertation would have been on tracking the infusion of money from Saudi Arabia to our change in policies, admissions at USC. So I think the picture's really very higher up. In my group, which was bilingual, we had no pipeline. We had no counseling, even in the doctoral program. Fast forward, I was at Chase Manhattan Bank, and we only admitted people into the program for bank talent from 5B schools. So I think it's a very interesting configuration of the road and where these all fit together. And I would just like your comments on what you have found.
What has been found in terms of what?
The trajectory from schools like USC or the other schools into the corporate executive suite or up the pipeline is social mobility.
Yeah. Is there any data that speaks to that at all, where graduates are ending up?
Not that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
We've run some stories about, responsive to the latter part of your question. If you look at the major investment banks, the major consulting firms, she's right. They recruit almost exclusively from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, maybe Dartmouth. They do that because their business model is to go get big deals from big corporations and say, we have only Harvard graduates working on your project. And then they hire them out of Harvard. They pay them a lot of money. They work them to death. It's horrible work. But they make a lot of money at this. So these industries, these firms, put a lot of money into catering to the employment, post-college employment offices of these universities. So these kids from Harvard, 90% of whom come in with no thought of becoming an investment banker, they then go to the employment, fairs, and they're just swamped with these recruiters from these handful of industries, and 40, 50, 60% of them become investment bankers and consultants, and then they go out and they live miserable lives, but they make millions of dollars, and then they give millions of dollars back to their colleges, which then have these ballooning endowments, right? Harvard's is, 70, 80 billion dollars. So it becomes this kind of weird, self-perpetuating wealth machine. And it's all because which industries colonize the career offices. It's very weird. There are political scientists actually doing research looking at this.
Yeah. And do your rankings account that they deal with internships, or do any of the rankings deal with that at all? The reason I bring that up is because sometimes it's internship experience that makes the difference in terms of employment after graduation. In other words, you take two graduates equal in all respects, except one has 2 internships and the other one doesn't, then the one with the internship experience is probably going to get hired. And I sometimes wonder the extent to which internships kind of trump the brand of a particular university. So that might be something worth exploring as well.
Ladies, do you have any data on
No,
that?
it's another. I don't think there's any national data on that.
It's not something we have data on. It's something we look at within stories. And it's,
Yeah.
it's interesting because I'll have a career center throw a statistic at me of, 100 or 99% of students are in the career center by the end of their freshman year. And I'm like, oh, that's a really high number. What do you do to make that happen? The answer from this particular university was donuts. I don't necessarily know if that counts as a great interaction rate if they've come in and said, thanks for the donut, you guys are real nice, and have left for the day, or if they've actually met with someone. The data is not quality enough for us to use in rankings, and it's also not consistent across universities.
Yeah, I think these are issues you deal with journalism, not data rankings, but you can bring data into it. We have a story by Grace Getty, one of our writers, in the current issue about using work study dollars to create internships paid internships with companies in the latter stages of a 4-year degree, because there's a real interest and a real concern about the mismatch between the skills that students have coming out of universities and the skills and qualities that companies are looking for. And for a lot of students who don't have big social networks, don't come from wealth, that first job, right, is most likely to shape their future career. So we think it's important, but I don't think there's any data on it.
Yeah, there is data, I think, to suggest that students who have internships and multiple internships do get hired more and do make more money from, I know NACE has that, but there's not at we would need it at every college in order to include it in the ranking. So we usually take that national stat and spin off it and say, here's how important internships are, here's how you can get them, here's what makes a good internship, things like that.
Hello. I have the microphone here. So my name is Scott, and I'm with the R.W. Jones Agency. I have one just general question. What advice, if you were sitting in front of a bunch of college presidents or you were counseling them on rankings, what advice would you give them as to your individual rankings?
I'll start, I guess. So one of our big challenges is getting data in a timely manner and to get accurate data. So if I had the ears of all 500 or 600 and some odd college presidents that were surveying their institutions, I would plead for data to be delivered on time, accurately, and with someone available to answer questions, because that's what enables me to do my job. And to hopefully catch anything that is problematic, because we certainly receive data from schools where I need to call back and say, thank you for your data. You've indicated that 110% of your students graduate in 4 years. Could we review these numbers and find where we've gone amiss? So just responsiveness is really the best thing that they can do.
Yeah, we don't individually collect the data from colleges. We use what they report to the Department of Education and other sources, but there are still data quality issues, so I would piggyback on that as a panel, to be a panelist. But also, I mean, I think that a lot of college presidents come to me with questions, like I said, about why they don't do as well as some colleges that they think that they are just as good in, or just as good as. And I mean, the answer may be that they very well are as good, or if not better than some colleges that do well in our rankings, but that they're just not hitting our specific metrics. And so I guess what I always kind of couch it as is like, we're not the end all be all. This is what we are saying is important, but you don't have to bend over backwards to do well in our ranking. We're just one. I can see it. I mean, a lot of people are like, whoa, we're not that expensive, and I'm like, well, compared to what your peers are charging, you are more expensive. And so I think it'd be like a combination of looking at what we're actually ranking and seeing if your institutional priorities don't align with ours, then don't worry about our ranking.
Yeah, I agree with the point that there are a lot of ways to rank something as complicated as a college. There is no one right way. And just as there's a lot of views of a mountain, there's a lot of views of colleges. And it's best to look at multiple rankings. Mm-hmm. But the advice I would give to a college president is look at ours and try to do better on ours. Because if you do better on ours, you're going to be a better college. I'll give you one example. We have a ranking of colleges that are best for adult learners. 30% of all undergrads are 25 years or older, which is the technical definition of an adult student. Most colleges have most of their classes between 10 a.m. and 3:30 p.m., which is when sleepy, partying undergrads want to take courses. If you're 30 years old and you've got a kid and a spouse and a full-time job, you can't go to class then. You need weekend and evening hours. That's 30% of the undergrads. Change your course schedules. You'll do better by your students, and you'll rise on our rankings, and you can brag about that to your state legislature.
Hi, my name is Heather Deerdorf. I'm the Director of College Counseling at a local independent school here in the DC area. And I want to thank you for providing some diversity to the U.S. News and World Report rankings, which have in many ways sort of dominated a lot of students and parents' thinking over the past I don't know, 25, 30 years or so. I mean, the concern that, mine's not really a question, it's just, you know, my concern all along, and I try not to pay too much attention to rankings. I liked yours very much, by the way. And I hope that more students aspire to be people who want to change the world and give back. I think for me, the press has had an influence in ways that I've seen through emphasis on going to school with a big athletic program so that we can go to games and continue to party. Emphasis on business, business, business at all costs, making money, making sure that you get the right job after you graduate, and a de-emphasis on the liberal arts experience, the humanities, the social sciences, being seen as less than. And it's a real concern. And you know, I worry that kids aren't thinking this through, that they're choosing colleges because they provide those three things and don't look at some of the soft skills and the people skills that they'll learn later on. So I'm hopefully fighting the good fight. I've been in college admissions my entire career, and it's just been interesting how also how colleges and universities have sort of morphed their marketing to sort of reflect what's been happening nationally with college rankings. So I didn't really have a question, I just wanted to comment. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get together, the three of us, 4 of us later, because you're a great source, and we'll.
I'm Carl Strickwood. I'm former president of Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. And my concerns about adjuncts and internships, I agree they're incredibly important in helping students, but the problem is when we've ever tried to look at them in terms of rankings, they do tend to replicate the resource inputs that institutions have. So I had 2 children, one went to St. Olaf and one went to Portland State. And St. Olaf is, I think, maybe just at that cusp of the nifty 50. And my daughter did great with internships, and I don't think she ever had an adjunct and did well. My son went to Portland State. Oregon funds its public institutions horribly. Portland State's at the bottom, maybe half part-time students and commuters, you know. Luckily, he managed to do well, just as a self-starter, but lots of adjuncts, no chance to get an internship and so on. And yet, in some ways, Portland State did an enormously impressive job with low-income disadvantaged students, you know, from where they could have been and to where they, you know, where they ended up. And so that's the one thing with adjuncts and internships, those are incredibly important, but it's the resource-rich institutions that don't have the adjuncts and have the internships. We might replicate them. I don't want to, you know, deprecate the impact of your rankings, but I think sometimes the stories you run with your rankings, it sort of speaks to the previous question, those are really powerful. I mean, as a college president, I have seen my board members say to me, look at this, you know, story that they ran with the rankings featuring what X or Y institution did that's not a name brand, has done something very important. And continuing to try to break that wall, because the reputational replication is a part of the media. I mean, Frank Bruni at the New York Times did a fascinating story on how, and he blamed the New York Times and the Post, they all do it. If a person they're featuring has gone to a name brand institution, they will mention that name brand institution. When they've gone to a place like Elizabethtown and a lot of other places, they won't. So, for example, there's this recent movie that came out, The Report. It's about the longest report ever done by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The lead investigator on it is Elizabethtown grad. Post ran a great story on him and his co-investigator. Co-investigator named her graduate institutions and her undergraduate institution. Dan Jones, the guy who is the other investigator who's from Elizabethtown grad, named that he'd gone a master's degree from Hopkins and master's degree from Harvard, not his undergraduate institution. And Frank Bruni had a better story on it. That's just one anecdote I picked up. But it was fascinating. He's right that a lot of those stories are not covered. So when you do that, I think you make a huge impact.
Yeah. So I know we're coming up on 10 o'clock, or it is 10 o'clock. We have time for one more, or?
Maybe a lightning round?
I'll be brief. My name is Mac. Excuse me. My name is Mac Riedel. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Florida. I'm actually here on an internship, so I can speak to the role internships play. My question is, what do you see in the role of online classes and online programs? How are they augmenting, like you said, the non-traditional student, or are they kind of taking away from the college experience and adding to the coffers of the university?
Okay. So maybe what we could do is answer that question as well as have a lightning round. And I guess the question I would ask for the lightning round after you address this gentleman's question is, what, if anything, might you do differently going forth, based not just on the college admission scandal of this year, but just the discussion we've heard in this room, excellent ideas about looking at maybe program level internships. There's all kinds of other metrics that we could make rankings more sophisticated. So, but please answer the gentleman's question as you also do the lightning round.
I think it's a great question. I've been wanting to do a story for a long time about Georgia Tech's introduction of low-cost, high-quality online programs, because for a long time what we were seeing is that colleges were pushing these online programs that cost just as much as their in-campus, and it was a little bit of a head scratch, especially once you develop the program and you get rid of the initial cost you'd expect without the overhead, that it should be cheaper. But we don't actually look at that in our rankings at all. And the lightning round question, one thing I would like to see us do is we use the most recent data available in only 1 year of data, and we see like this year we actually didn't change our methodology at all from last year, and we had a brand new rankings because there is like year-to-year swings in the data. So I think Washington Monthly does this. I'd love to use 2, maybe 3 years of data and take the average of that. I think that'd give us a more reliable long-term result. And I also, I know there's been one of the data pieces we love is that economic mobility number, but I know in the past year there's been some proposals about better ways to measure economic mobility or different ways. So most of the California schools in our system do really great on that number of Pell Grant recipients graduating and students from bottom income quintile going to the top, simply because California has a huge population of those students to draw from compared to a place like Minnesota, which has a lot, or Wisconsin, or a variety of states, which might be serving their state's population very well, but just doesn't have as big of a population of those students as California. So I'd like to maybe look at, and we thought about doing it this year, but honestly it just felt rushed and we didn't want to make like a non-research driven decision on the best way to handle that. So those are the 2 things that I'm looking at most directly.
And I'm going to study what these folks are doing better so we can steal some of their better ideas.
Okay, anything different? Go.
To your question, also I have a lot of interest in covering the online programs. I don't necessarily see how it would be incorporated as a component in the rankings, in part because of the quality of the data. That seems to be the theme of my issue with a lot of things, is the quality of the data. And to the lightning round question, I want to continue exploring other data resources. We look at them every year. We sit down, we had this big roundtable discussion of editors debating what may or may not need to change, other data that's available, if things have reached a point where we're ready to make a change, or if we want to let data continue to develop and be stronger for the next year's ranking. And I certainly want to continue that using some of the discussion from today, and also just using that to inform other reporting, because there's a lot of other higher ed coverage that may not fit into the rankings mold, but fits into the bigger picture for higher education.
I want to address the gentleman from Elizabethtown College and just say that one of the joys of what we do is highlighting colleges that are doing great work, don't get the recognition, and we know that when we do that, it really matters to the college, to the community, and it sends a message to other colleges that aren't brand names. Keep doing good work and you will be recognized. And the more we do that, I think the more we break the stranglehold of wealth, exclusivity, and fame that's so undermining the higher education system.
Excellent. So I know we could continue this discussion well beyond the hour that's been allotted, but we are actually a little bit past 10. So I guess we'd like to just thank our panelists with a round of applause, please. And thank you for joining us, and I'm sure that the panelists will be here. I'm volunteering you all if you have any questions, especially for the journalists in the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.